The Vanishing Fishbowl. Chapter 1. A fishy situation. Whiskers McTabby was no ordinary house cat. With his sleek black fur, piercing green eyes, and a tiny magnifying glass hanging from his collar, he was known throughout the neighborhood as the greatest feline detective who ever lived. No mystery was too small, no puzzle too perplexing for Whiskers to solve. One sunny afternoon, as Whiskers was lounging on the windowsill of his human's cozy apartment, a frantic meow caught his attention. He peered down to see Mrs. Fluffington, the elegant Persian cat from next door, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk below. "Whiskers, Whiskers," she called, her fluffy white tail swishing anxiously. "I need your help. It's an emergency." Whiskers' ears perked up. A new case. He gracefully leaped down from the windowsill, slipped through his cat flap, and trotted down the stairs to meet Mrs. Fluffington. "What seems to be the trouble, madam?" Whiskers asked, his voice smooth and professional. Mrs. Fluffington's blue eyes were wide with worry. "Oh, Whiskers, it's terrible. My human's prized goldfish, Bubbles, has vanished along with his entire fishbowl." Whiskers raised an eyebrow. "A vanishing fishbowl? Now that was intriguing. Tell me everything, Mrs. Fluffington. When did you last see Bubbles in his bowl?" "This morning at breakfast time," Mrs. Fluffington explained. "My human fed Bubbles as usual. The fishbowl was on its stand in the living room, right by the big potted plant. But when I woke up from my midday nap, poof, the whole thing was gone." Whiskers nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "And you're certain your human didn't move it?" "Positive," Mrs. Fluffington insisted. "My human left for work right after feeding Bubbles. She hasn't been home since." "I see," Whiskers mused, stroking his whiskers thoughtfully. "Well, Mrs. Fluffington, you've come to the right detective. I'll take the case." Relief washed over Mrs. Fluffington's furry face. "Oh, thank you, Whiskers. What do we do first?" "First," Whiskers declared, "we investigate the scene of the crime. Lead the way to your apartment, madam." As they trotted side by side down the street, Whiskers couldn't help but feel a tingle of excitement. A vanishing fishbowl was no ordinary case. He had a feeling this mystery would put all his detective skills to the test. Upon reaching Mrs. Fluffington's apartment, Whiskers immediately got to work. He sniffed around the empty space where the fishbowl had stood, his sensitive nose picking up the faintest scent of fish food and tap water. "Hum," he muttered, peering through his tiny magnifying glass at the polished wooden stand. No scratch marks. Whatever took the fishbowl didn't drag it off the stand. Mrs. Fluffington watched nervously from the couch. "What does that mean, Whiskers?" "It means, my dear Mrs. Fluffington, that our culprit either lifted the bowl very carefully or," Whiskers paused dramatically, "the fishbowl vanished into thin air." Mrs. Fluffington gasped. "But that's impossible." "In the world of detective work, Mrs. Fluffington, we must consider all possibilities, no matter how improbable," Whiskers explained sagely. "Now, tell me, have there been any strange occurrences in the apartment lately? Any unusual visitors?" Mrs. Fluffington thought for a moment. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a peculiar incident last week. My human brought home a new clock for the living room. But the strangest thing happened. It ran backward. The hands moved counterclockwise. She returned it to the store the very next day." Whiskers' ears twitched with interest. "A backward clock, you say? Most intriguing. Where did your human purchase this clock?" "At that new shop down on Maple Street," Mrs. Fluffington replied. "Tick-Tock Treasures, I believe it's called." Whiskers nodded, filing away this information. "Excellent. Now, one last question before we continue our investigation. Did you notice anything unusual about Bubbles in the days leading up to his disappearance?" Mrs. Fluffington furrowed her brow in concentration. "Come to think of it, yes. The day before he vanished, Bubbles was swimming in strange patterns. Instead of his usual circles, he was swimming in figure eights and zigzags. I thought perhaps my human had changed his food." "Curiouser and curiouser," Whiskers murmured. He paced back and forth, his tail swishing as he pieced together the clues: a backward clock, a zigzagging fish, and now a vanishing fishbowl. "Mrs. Fluffington, I believe we're dealing with something far more complex than a simple theft." "What do you mean, Whiskers?" Mrs. Fluffington asked, her voice trembling. Whiskers turned to her, his green eyes glinting with determination. "I mean, my dear, that we may be looking at a case of temporal displacement." Mrs. Fluffington blinked in confusion. "Temporal what meant?" "Displacement," Whiskers repeated. "In simpler terms, I believe Bubbles and his fishbowl may have been transported through time." Mrs. Fluffington's jaw dropped. "Through time? But how is that possible?" "That, my fluffy friend, is exactly what we need to find out," Whiskers declared. "And I have a feeling our first clue lies in that curious little shop on Maple Street. Are you up for a little field investigation, Mrs. Fluffington?" Despite her nervousness, Mrs. Fluffington nodded bravely. "For Bubbles, I'll do anything. Lead the way, Detective Whiskers." And so, with the sun beginning to dip towards the horizon, Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington set off towards Maple Street, unaware of the strange and wondrous adventure that awaited them. The case of the Vanishing Fishbowl was only just beginning, and Whiskers McTabby, feline detective extraordinaire, was determined to solve it, no matter where or when the clues might lead. As they trotted down the sidewalk, Whiskers' mind raced with possibilities. Could the backward clock and the vanishing fishbowl be connected? What other temporal anomalies might they encounter? And most importantly, how would they bring Bubbles back to the present? One thing was certain: this was shaping up to be Whiskers' most challenging case yet, but with his keen feline senses and razor-sharp intellect, he was ready to unravel the mystery of the vanishing fishbowl, one clue at a time. Chapter 2. Tick-Tock Troubles. The sun was setting over Maple Street as Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington approached Tick-Tock Treasures. The shop's window displayed an assortment of clocks, each one stranger than the last. One clock had 13 numbers, another seemed to be made entirely of cheese, and a third appeared to be running on cat treats instead of batteries. "Curiouser and curiouser," Whiskers muttered, peering through the window. Mrs. Fluffington shuffled nervously. "How are we going to get inside, Whiskers?" "We're cats, remember." Whiskers winked at her. "My dear Mrs. Fluffington, a good detective always has a trick up his sleeve." Or in this case, under his collar he reached under his neck and pulled out a small, shiny object. "Is that a lockpick?" Mrs. Fluffington gasped. "I prefer to call it a universal key," Whiskers replied with a mischievous grin. "Now, keep watch while I work my magic." With surprising dexterity for a cat, Whiskers manipulated the lockpick in the keyhole. After a few tense moments, there was a satisfying click, and the door swung open. "After you, Madam," Whiskers said with a gentlemanly bow. They crept into the dimly lit shop, their paws making no sound on the tiled floor. The tick-tocking of hundreds of clocks filled the air, creating an eerie symphony. "Look at all these strange clocks," Mrs. Fluffington whispered, her eyes wide. "Which one do you think is responsible for Bubbles' disappearance?" Whiskers surveyed the room, his detective instincts on high alert. "It could be any of them, or none of them. We need to find clues specific to our case." As they explored, Whiskers' attention was drawn to a peculiar contraption in the corner. It looked like a giant hourglass, but instead of sand, it was filled with shimmering, rainbow-colored liquid that flowed both up and down. "Now that's not something you see every day," Whiskers mused, approaching the device. Suddenly, a deep voice boomed through the shop, making both cats jump. "Indeed, it isn't, my feline friend." From behind a curtain emerged a tall, thin man with wild gray hair and a beard that seemed to sparkle with tiny lights. He wore a vest covered in gears and springs, and a monocle that magnified one twinkling eye. "I am Professor Cornelius Kronos," the man announced, "proprietor of Tick-Tock Treasures and master of time itself." Whiskers, recovering quickly from the surprise, stepped forward. "Greetings, Professor. I am Whiskers McTabby, detective, and this is my client, Mrs. Fluffington. We're investigating a case of temporal displacement involving a missing goldfish and his bowl. Would you happen to know anything about that?" Professor Kronos stroked his glittering beard thoughtfully. "A missing goldfish, you say? Swimming through the currents of time instead of water? How fascinating." Mrs. Fluffington piped up. "Can you help us bring Bubbles back, Professor?" "Ah, my dear," the professor said, kneeling down to their level. "Time is a tricky thing. It's not just a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean with currents, eddies, and whirlpools. Your Bubbles could be anywhere, or anyone." Whiskers' eyes narrowed. "But you sold a backward-running clock to Mrs. Fluffington's human last week. Surely that's not a coincidence." Professor Kronos clapped his hands together. "Oh ho, sharp as a tack, aren't you? Yes, that clock was one of my special creations, a temporal tether, if you will. It was meant to anchor small objects in the present, preventing them from drifting through time." "But it didn't work," Mrs. Fluffington said, accusingly. The professor's face fell. "No, I'm afraid it didn't. That's why it was returned. But I never expected it to cause a full temporal displacement. Something else must have interfered with its chronological field." Whiskers paced back and forth, his tail swishing in thought. "Professor, is there any way to track Bubbles through time? To figure out where, or when, he might have gone?" Professor Kronos brightened. "As a matter of fact, there might be. Come, let me show you my latest invention." He led them to a workbench covered in gears, springs, and glowing crystals. In the center sat what looked like a pocket watch, but its face was a swirling vortex of colors. "This is the chrono compass," the professor explained proudly. "It can detect disturbances in the time-space continuum. If your Bubbles left a temporal wake, this device should be able to track it." Whiskers leaned in close, studying the device. "Fascinating. But how do we use it?" "Ah, that's the tricky part," Professor Kronos admitted. "It needs something connected to the displaced object. A strand of Bubbles' fin, perhaps? Or a drop of water from his bowl?" Mrs. Fluffington's face fell. "But we don't have anything like that. The whole fishbowl vanished, remember." Whiskers, however, had a gleam in his eye. "Not quite, Mrs. Fluffington. Remember what you told me earlier? About Bubbles swimming in strange patterns the day before he vanished?" Mrs. Fluffington nodded, confused. Well, Whiskers continued, fish don't change their swimming patterns for no reason. What if Bubbles was already being affected by temporal energy? If so, he might have left traces of chronological particles in the water. Professor Kronos finished excitedly, and those particles might still be present in the stand where the fishbowl sat. Precisely, Whiskers exclaimed. Mrs. Fluffington, we need to return to your apartment at once. Professor, may we borrow the chrono compass? Professor Kronos hesitated. It's a delicate instrument, but this is a matter of temporal importance. Very well, you may take it, but please be careful. As Whiskers carefully took the chrono compass in his mouth, Mrs. Fluffington looked at him with admiration. Whiskers, you're brilliant, but how are we going to explain all this to my human when she gets home? Whiskers' eyes twinkled with mischief. My dear Mrs. Fluffington, let's focus on finding Bubbles first. We'll cross that temporal bridge when we come to it. And with that, the two cats bid farewell to the eccentric Professor Kronos and dashed out into the night, the chrono compass glowing softly in Whiskers' grasp. The hunt for Bubbles was about to take them on a journey beyond their wildest imagination, a race through time itself to bring a beloved goldfish home. Little did they know that their adventure was about to become even more complicated, as the true nature of Bubbles' disappearance was far stranger than even Whiskers could have guessed. As they ran through the darkening streets, the chrono compass began to pulse with an otherworldly light, hinting at the incredible journey that lay ahead. Chapter 3. Ripples in Time. Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington raced back to her apartment, the chrono compass swinging from Whiskers' collar. As they bounded up the stairs, Mrs. Fluffington suddenly froze. Oh no, she gasped. I hear my human inside. She's home early. Whiskers' mind raced. Quick, to the fire escape, he hissed. They darted to the window and slipped out onto the metal grating. Through the glass, they could see Mrs. Fluffington's human looking around the living room, a puzzled expression on her face. Where's Bubbles? They heard her say. And why is there water on the floor? Mrs. Fluffington turned to Whiskers, panic in her eyes. Water? But the fishbowl vanished hours ago. Whiskers twitched thoughtfully. Interesting. It seems time isn't just affecting Bubbles, but the very space he occupied. We must act fast. Carefully they crept back inside once Mrs. Fluffington's human moved to the kitchen. Whiskers approached the damp spot on the floor, the chrono compass held gently in his mouth. As soon as the device touched the wet patch, it began to spin wildly, its face a whirlwind of colors. Eureka! Whiskers exclaimed softly. We've found our temporal trail. Suddenly the room began to shimmer and distort. Mrs. Fluffington's eyes widened in alarm. Whiskers, what's happening? Hold on tight, my dear, Whiskers replied, his voice steady despite the strange sensations enveloping them. I believe we're about to take a little trip. In a flash of rainbow light, the two cats vanished from the apartment, leaving behind only a few sparkling motes of chrono particles. When Whiskers opened his eyes, he found himself in a bizarre, swirling vortex of colors and shapes. Beside him, Mrs. Fluffington was curled into a terrified ball of fluff. Where are we? She whimpered. Whiskers looked around, his detective's mind taking in every detail. If I'm not mistaken, Mrs. Fluffington, we're in the time stream itself. All around them, fragments of different times and places floated by. They saw dinosaurs roaming prehistoric jungles, knights jousting in medieval tournaments, and sleek flying cars zooming through futuristic cityscapes. "Look," Mrs. Fluffington cried, pointing with her paw. "Is that Bubbles?" Sure enough, floating serenely through the chaos was a familiar fishbowl, Bubbles swimming happily inside, as if nothing was amiss. Whiskers' eyes narrowed in concentration. "We need to catch up to him. Mrs. Fluffington, can you swim?" "Swim? In time?" she asked incredulously. "Just pretend it's a big ball of yarn," Whiskers instructed. "Follow my lead." With graceful strokes, Whiskers began to swim through the time stream, Mrs. Fluffington awkwardly paddling behind him. They dodged past Roman legionnaires, narrowly avoided a lunar landing module, and swerved around a herd of woolly mammoths. As they got closer to Bubbles, Whiskers noticed something odd. The fishbowl seemed to be surrounded by a faint, pulsing energy field. "Of course," he exclaimed. "The backward clock must have created a temporal bubble around Bubbles. That's why he vanished with his entire bowl." They were almost within reaching distance when suddenly a dark shadow loomed over them. Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington looked up to see an enormous grinning cat face. "Well, well," purred a voice that seemed to echo through time itself. "What have we here?" "A couple of time-traveling kitties trying to steal my new toy." The massive cat materialized fully, revealing a sleek, black feline with glowing yellow eyes and a collar that sparkled with otherworldly energy. "I am Kronos, the time cat," the creature announced, "guardian of the time stream and collector of chrono curiosities, and that little fishbowl is my latest acquisition." Whiskers stepped forward bravely. "Now see here, Kronos. That fishbowl and its occupant belong in our time. We've come to take them home." Kronos laughed, a sound like tinkling clock chimes. "Oh, have you now? And what makes you think you can challenge the time cat, little detective?" Mrs. Fluffington, overcoming her fear, spoke up. "Because Bubbles is my friend, and friends don't abandon each other, no matter what time they're in." Her words seemed to give Whiskers an idea. He turned to Kronos with a sly grin. "I propose a challenge, time cat. A test of wits and skill. If we win, you return Bubbles to us. If you win, well, you get 2 more chrono curiosities for your collection." Kronos' eyes gleamed with interest. "A challenge, you say? How delightful. Very well, little detective. I accept. But be warned, I've had eons to perfect my skills. What game did you have in mind?" Whiskers glanced at the chrono compass, still hanging from his collar. "A scavenger hunt through time. 3 objects from 3 different eras. First one to collect all 3 and return here wins." Kronos clapped his paws together, sending ripples through the time stream. "Oh, how fun. You're on, detective. Prepare yourselves for a race through history." As Kronos began to lay out the rules of their temporal scavenger hunt, Whiskers caught Mrs. Fluffington's worried eye. He gave her a reassuring wink. The case of the Vanishing Fishbowl had become far more complex than either of them had imagined, but Whiskers McTabby was never one to back down from a challenge, even if that challenge spanned the whole of time itself. Little did they know that this scavenger hunt would take them to the far corners of history, testing not just their wits and skills, but also their friendship and courage. As they prepared to embark on their time-twisting adventure, Bubbles continued to swim peacefully in his bowl, blissfully unaware of the cosmic competition about to unfold for his fate. Chapter 4. A Race Through History. Kronos the time cat's yellow eyes glowed with mischief as he laid out the rules of their scavenger hunt. 3 items, 3 time periods, he purred. First, a dinosaur egg from the Cretaceous period. Second, a golden scarab from ancient Egypt. And third, a microchip from the year 2099. The first to collect all 3 and return here wins. Whiskers nodded, his mind already calculating strategies. Agreed. But how do we travel to these specific times? Kronos flicked his tail, and 3 shimmering portals appeared in the time stream. These will take you where you need to go, but be warned, time travel can be unpredictable. With a wink at Mrs. Fluffington, Whiskers declared, "We're ready. Let the hunt begin." In a flash, both Kronos and the cat detectives dove into separate portals. Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington found themselves tumbling through a vortex of swirling colors before landing with a soft thud on warm, spongy ground. Mrs. Fluffington blinked, taking in their surroundings. Towering ferns and strange, primitive trees stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was thick and humid, filled with unfamiliar scents and sounds. "Welcome to the Cretaceous period," Whiskers announced, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Now, let's find ourselves a dinosaur egg." They crept through the prehistoric jungle, Mrs. Fluffington jumping at every rustle and roar. Suddenly, Whiskers held up a paw. "Look there," he whispered, pointing to a clearing ahead. A massive nest sat in the center, filled with eggs the size of footballs. But guarding the nest was an equally massive mother dinosaur, her scales glinting in the ancient sunlight. "That's a Maiasaura," Whiskers explained. "A good mother lizard. She won't leave her nest unguarded." Mrs. Fluffington gulped. "So how do we get an egg?" Whiskers stroked his whiskers thoughtfully. "We need a distraction. Mrs. Fluffington, how's your roaring?" Moments later, Mrs. Fluffington found herself hiding in a nearby bush, summoning her courage. With a deep breath, she let out the loudest, most ferocious cat roar she could muster. The Maiasaura's head snapped up, looking in Mrs. Fluffington's direction. As the dinosaur lumbered towards the sound, Whiskers darted out, snatched an egg from the nest, and rushed back to Mrs. Fluffington. "Excellent work," he praised. "Now, let's move on to ancient Egypt." They dove back into the portal, the dinosaur egg tucked safely between them. This time they emerged in a world of golden sand and scorching sun. The great pyramids loomed in the distance, their peaks gleaming. The golden scarab, Whiskers mused. Where would we find such a thing? Mrs. Fluffington, shaking sand from her fur, pointed with her paw. "Look, a procession." Indeed, a grand parade was making its way towards the largest pyramid. At its head was an ornate litter carried by servants, and atop it sat a regal figure adorned with gold and jewels. The pharaoh, Whiskers breathed. And look at his staff, it's topped with a golden scarab. They followed the procession, slipping unseen between the feet of the crowd. As the pharaoh descended from his litter at the pyramid's entrance, Whiskers saw their chance. "Mrs. Fluffington," he whispered, "I need you to create another distraction. Can you knock over that vase?" With a flick of her tail, Mrs. Fluffington sent a costly-looking vase crashing to the ground. In the ensuing commotion, Whiskers darted forward, unhooked the golden scarab from the pharaoh's staff, and retreated into the shadows. "2 down, 1 to go," he declared triumphantly. "Ready for the future." Their final portal took them to a sleek, gleaming cityscape. Flying vehicles zipped between towering skyscrapers, and robots walked alongside humans on the streets below. 2099, Mrs. Fluffington murmured in awe. How will we ever find a single microchip in all of this? Whiskers' eyes narrowed in concentration. We need to think like detectives. In our time, where would we find the most advanced technology? A research lab, Mrs. Fluffington exclaimed. They made their way to a massive building with Future Tech Industries emblazoned on its side. Slipping inside through a ventilation shaft, they found themselves in a lab filled with blinking lights and humming machinery. Their whiskers pointed to a workbench where a scientist was assembling a tiny device. That must be the latest microchip. But as they crept closer, an alarm suddenly blared. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice announced, "Intruder alert. Intruder alert." Quick thinking, Mrs. Fluffington Whiskers urged. What's our play? In a moment of inspiration, Mrs. Fluffington leaped onto the workbench, scattering tools and components. In the chaos, Whiskers snatched the microchip and dashed for the exit. They burst out of the building, alarms still ringing behind them. We did it, Mrs. Fluffington cheered. We have all 3 items. But as they prepared to return to the time stream, a familiar chuckle echoed around them. Kronos the time cat materialized, holding his own set of collected items. Well done, little detectives, he purred. But I'm afraid I beat you by a whisker. Your bubbles belongs to me now. The Whiskers, however, didn't look defeated. Instead, a sly grin spread across his face. Did you really, Kronos? Are you sure you have the right microchip? Kronos frowned, examining his prize. His eyes widened in shock. This is just a regular computer chip from the 21st century. How did you? A good detective always thinks ahead, Whiskers declared proudly. We swapped the chips during the chaos in the lab. The real 2099 microchip is right here. He held up the genuine article, its futuristic design unmistakable. Kronos' jaw dropped in disbelief. Incredible, the time cat murmured. In all my eons, I've never been outsmarted like this. Very well, detective. You've won fair and square. The fishbowl is yours. With a flick of his tail, Kronos summoned Bubbles and his bowl. The little goldfish swam happily, oblivious to the incredible adventure that had unfolded around him. As they prepared to return to their own time, Kronos regarded Whiskers with newfound respect. You know, detective, you'd make an excellent guardian of the time stream. Perhaps we'll meet again someday. Whiskers tipped an imaginary hat. Perhaps we will, Kronos. Time will tell. In a flash of chrono energy, Whiskers, Mrs. Fluffington, and Bubbles vanished from 2099, hurtling back towards their own familiar time and place. Their greatest adventure was coming to an end, but the memory of their time-traveling escapade would last a lifetime or perhaps even longer. Chapter 5. Home Sweet Home. With a disorienting swirl of colors and a soft pop, Whiskers, Mrs. Fluffington, and Bubbles in his fishbowl materialized back in Mrs. Fluffington's living room. The clock on the wall showed that barely an hour had passed since their incredible journey began. Mrs. Fluffington's human was just returning from the kitchen, a puzzled look still on her face. I could have sworn Bubbles was missing, she muttered, shaking her head. Must be working too hard. As their human settled on the couch with a book, Mrs. Fluffington turned to Whiskers, her eyes shining with admiration. Whiskers, you did it. You solved the case of the Vanishing Fishbowl. Whiskers puffed out his chest proudly. "We did it, Mrs. Fluffington. I couldn't have done it without your quick thinking and bravery." They both looked at Bubbles, swimming contentedly in his bowl as if he'd never left. The little goldfish did a quick loop-de-loop, almost as if he was winking at them. "Do you think he remembers any of it?" Mrs. Fluffington wondered. Whiskers chuckled. "Who knows? Perhaps in his dreams he'll swim through the time stream again." Just then, there was a soft tink against the window. They turned to see Professor Kronos outside on the fire escape, grinning and waving. "I say," the professor whispered as they joined him outside, "that was quite an adventure you two had. My chrono compass recorded the whole thing. Absolutely fascinating." Professor Whiskers said seriously, "I think it's best if we keep this adventure our little secret. The world isn't ready to know about time travel and cosmic cat entities." Professor Kronos nodded sagely. Quite right, but I do hope you'll consider collaborating on future temporal experiments. Nothing too dangerous, of course." Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington exchanged a glance. "We'll think about it," Professor Whiskers said diplomatically. As Professor Kronos bid them farewell and climbed down the fire escape, his beard twinkling merrily, Mrs. Fluffington turned to Whiskers. "Do you really think we'll have more time travel adventures?" Whiskers' green eyes sparkled with mischief. "My dear Mrs. Fluffington, in my line of work, anything is possible. But for now, I think we've earned a nice long cat nap." Mrs. Fluffington couldn't argue with that. As they curled up together on the windowsill, basking in the warm afternoon sun, she found herself purring contentedly. Who would have thought that a missing fishbowl could lead to such an extraordinary adventure? Whiskers was already dozing off, but he opened one eye and smiled at Mrs. Fluffington. "You know," he murmured sleepily, "I have a feeling this is just the beginning of a beautiful friendship." As they drifted off to sleep, the chrono compass, still hanging from Whiskers' collar, gave a soft golden glow. In its face, just for a moment, the image of a grinning cat with glowing yellow eyes appeared, winked once, and vanished. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the time stream, Kronos the Time Cat chuckled to himself. "Until next time, Detective Whiskers," he purred. "Until next time." And so, as Whiskers and Mrs. Fluffington slept, and Bubbles swam peaceful circles in his bowl, the world continued to turn, blissfully unaware of the incredible adventure that had unfolded across time and space. But in the heart of one very special feline detective, the embers of excitement glowed warmly, ready to spark into flame when the next mystery came calling. After all, in the life of Whiskers McTabby, cat detective extraordinaire, there was always another case just around the corner, or perhaps just around the next bend in time. The end.